The Baltic Sea in July 1944 was a mirror of steel and deceptive calm. High above the white-capped waves, the Junkers Ju-88D1, a specialized long-range reconnaissance variant, hummed with the steady rhythmic vibration of its twin Jumo engines. Inside the cramped, glass-nosed cockpit, Lieutenant Erich Voss wasn't looking at the scenery. His eyes were glued to the intervalometer of the massive RB5030 cameras mounted in the belly of the aircraft. He was deep into Swedish airspace, a neutral territory that, on paper, was off-limits. But the German High Command was desperate. They needed to know if the rumors of Allied material flowing through Swedish ports were true. Voss was a photo recon specialist, a man who fought the war with lenses and shutter speeds rather than machine guns. He had spent the last hour meticulously mapping the Swedish coastline near Malmö, the shutter of the camera firing with a mechanical clack hiss every few seconds. To the world, Sweden was a sanctuary of peace. To the Luftwaffe, it was a blind spot that needed to be illuminated. Suddenly, the rhythmic hum of the starboard engine was replaced by a violent, stuttering cough. A plume of white coolant vapor erupted from the nacelle, instantly coating the side windows. Voss's heart hammered against his ribs. He hadn't been hit by flak. There were no puffs of black smoke. This was mechanical betrayal. Within seconds, the starboard engine seized with a sickening metallic shriek, and the Ju-88 banked sharply toward the grey water. "Feather the prop. Shut down the fuel lines." Voss barked to his navigator, but the cockpit was already filling with the smell of hot glycol. They were losing altitude fast. To their left lay the open sea, a certain watery grave. To their right lay the rugged, green coastline of Sweden. Voss made a split-second decision that would change the course of the northern front. He wouldn't ditch. He would land. He banked the heavy, lopsided aircraft toward a flat stretch of coastal meadow near a fishing village. As the fixed landing gear touched the uneven turf, the Junkers bucked like a wild horse. The nose glass shattered, spraying the cockpit with shards, before the aircraft finally skidded to a halt in a cloud of dust and dry grass. Silence returned to the meadow, broken only by the ticking of the cooling metal. Voss reached for the self-destruct lever of the cameras, a thermal charge designed to melt the film and the lenses into an unrecognizable slag. But as he gripped the handle, a shadow fell across the cockpit. He looked up to see a squad of Swedish soldiers in their distinct light blue uniforms, their bolt-action rifles leveled at his head. A tall officer with a neutral, unreadable expression stepped forward and tapped on the glass with his pistol. Voss let go of the lever. He was a prisoner in a neutral land, but more importantly, his cameras, and the precious film inside, were now in the hands of Swedish intelligence. Lieutenant Voss expected the cold, efficient interrogation of a military prison. Instead, he found himself in a sun-drenched, wood-paneled office in Stockholm, overlooking the calm waters of the Rödarfjorden. The Swedish officer across from him, Major Arvidsson, didn't wear a mask of hostility. He wore a well-tailored uniform and a faint, polite smile that was far more unnerving than a scowl. On the mahogany desk between them sat a porcelain coffee pot and a silver tray of pastries, and Voss's RB-5030's flight log, its leather cover stained with engine oil. "Neutrality, Lieutenant, is a very active profession," Arvidsson said, pouring a cup of coffee. He spoke German with a flawless, melodic accent. "It requires us to be friends with everyone, and yet, trusted by no one. Your presence here is an inconvenience. But your cameras, they are a fascination." Voss remained silent, his jaw set. He was trained to give only his name, rank, and serial number. But the Swedes weren't asking about his squadron or his base in Norway. They were talking about the technical specifications of his lenses. For 3 days, the interrogation felt more like a scientific seminar. Arvidsson brought in civilian experts, optical engineers from local firms, who spent hours discussing the focal lengths and the chemical composition of the Abwehr film Voss had been using. They were playing a delicate game. Sweden was a geopolitical tightrope. To the south, the German Reich was a massive, hungry neighbor that provided the coal that kept Swedish homes warm. To the west, the Allies were the rising tide of the future. The Swedish Secret Service, the Säkerhetspolisen, knew that every piece of intelligence they gathered was a currency. "We have developed your film, Erich," Arvidsson remarked casually on the fourth day, leaning back in his chair. He slid a stack of high-gloss enlargements across the desk. Voss's heart skipped. They were perfect, pin-sharp images of the Malmö docks. But as he looked closer, his brow furrowed. There was something wrong. The shadows were slightly off. A row of coastal freighters he remembered seeing was missing, replaced by empty piers. Our technicians took the liberty of cleaning the negatives, Arvidsson whispered, his eyes locking onto Voss's with a sudden predatory sharpness. We noticed your cameras were misaligned. We've fixed them for you. We've even added some very interesting, new targets further up the coast. Targets that your general staff will find very, very alarming. Voss realized the trap. The Swedes weren't just interrogating him. They were using him as a courier. They had doctored his reconnaissance photos to show a massive, non-existent Allied build-up in a neutral Swedish port. A phantom army that would force the German High Command to divert precious divisions away from the real invasion fronts in the south. If you tell your superiors we changed these, you stay here for the duration of the war, Arvidsson said, his voice dropping to a low hum. If you go back and present these as your own heroic findings, you go home tomorrow. A hero of the Reich. Which will it be, Lieutenant? The truth in a cell, or a lie with a medal? The laboratory in the basement of the Swedish intelligence headquarters smelled of acetic acid and ozone. Under the harsh, clinical glow of a single overhead bulb, Voss watched as a Swedish technician, a man with the steady, detached hands of a watchmaker, reassembled the RB5030 camera. To any German mechanic at the Oslo airfield, it would look like the same rugged piece of Zeiss optics that had left 3 days ago. But inside its belly, the mechanism had been transformed into a Trojan horse. Major Arvidsson stood in the shadows, his arms crossed over his chest. We've replaced your film magazines, Erich. These are the corrected versions. Our darkroom specialists have spent the last 48 hours ensuring the grain of the film, the sun's angle, and even the atmospheric haze match your flight log perfectly. The deception was a masterpiece of technical forgery. The Swedish experts hadn't just removed ships, they had added them. Using a technique of composite masking, they had layered images of British troop transports and American supply ships, vessels that were actually hundreds of miles away in the North Atlantic, onto the pristine docks of neutral Swedish harbors. To the analysts in Berlin, it would look like Sweden was no longer neutral. It would look like the Allies were preparing a massive end run through the Baltic to strike at the heart of Germany from the north. You must understand the technicality of the lie, Arvidsson said, stepping into the light. He tapped the brass housing of the camera. If your superiors suspect the film was tampered with, they will look for splices or chemical residue. They will find none. We've re-exposed the entire roll onto fresh Abwehr stock using a precision enlarger. It is, for all intents and purposes, an original negative. Voss felt a cold sweat prickling his neck. He was a professional. He knew how German intelligence, the Abwehr, scrutinized every frame. They looked for the tell, the one shadow that didn't match the compass, the one ship's wake that ended too abruptly. But looking at the contact sheets Arvidsson showed him, Voss couldn't find a single flaw. The Swedes had even added accidental lens flare and slight motion blur to simulate the vibration of a struggling junker's engine. The camera is now calibrated to show a navigation error of 12 kilometers to the east, Arvidsson continued, his voice dropping to a low, instructional hum. When you return, you will tell them your compass failed. You will say you drifted over Karlskrona. This film will prove that the British are building a secret deep water port there. Voss looked at the camera, then at Arvidsson. He realized he wasn't just a pilot anymore. He was a delivery system for a strategic nightmare. The Swedes were betting that the German High Command's paranoia would outweigh their common sense. If Voss played his part, the Wehrmacht would pull 3 panzer divisions from the crumbling Eastern Front and send them to the Baltic coast to guard against a phantom invasion that would never come. Pack it up, Arvidsson signaled to the technician. The lieutenant has a flight to catch. And Erich? Remember, if you blink when you hand this film over, you aren't just a failed spy. You are the man who invited the Allies into Sweden. And we have a very long memory. The transition from prisoner to hero began in the pre-dawn chill of an isolated Swedish airstrip near Kalmar. Voss stood on the tarmac, his breath hitching in the misty air, as a team of Swedish mechanics finished a hasty repair on his Junkers Ju-88. They had patched the glycol leak with a temporary sealant and replaced the shattered nose glass with a crude but functional plexiglass sheet. To any casual observer, it looked like a desperate, battlefield fix. In reality, every bolt had been tightened with calculated precision to ensure he reached German-occupied Norway, but not a mile further. Major Arvidsson stood by the wing, his hands buried in the pockets of his greatcoat. He looked less like an intelligence officer and more like a weary traveler. "The fuel tanks are half full, Erich. Just enough to get you to the Luftwaffe base at Stavanger. If you divert, you'll ditch in the North Sea. We've made sure of that." Voss climbed into the cockpit, the familiar scent of stale sweat and hydraulic fluid wrapping around him like a shroud. The RB-5030 camera was already bolted back into its bay, its poisoned film magazines locked and ready. He felt the weight of the machine, not just the tons of duralumin and fuel, but the weight of the strategic lie he was about to hand to his superiors. "Why let me go?" Voss asked, his voice cracking as he adjusted his flight helmet. "You could have kept the camera. You could have turned us over to the British." Arvidsson stepped closer, the roar of the starter motor beginning to whine in the background. "If we keep you, we have a diplomatic incident. If we turn you over to the British, we lose our neutrality. But if we send you back with a discovery so terrifying that Berlin cannot ignore it, then we buy Sweden another 6 months of peace. We aren't helping the Allies, Lieutenant. We are helping ourselves. Now, fly. And remember your navigation error." With a stuttering cough, the Jumo engines roared to life, spitting blue flame into the grey morning. Voss taxied the battered Junkers to the end of the grass strip. He felt a surreal sense of vertigo. Just 4 days ago, he was a captured spy facing a firing squad or a cold cell. Now, he was being escorted to the runway by the very men who had interrogated him. As the wheels left the ground, Voss looked back. Arvidsson was a shrinking speck on the tarmac, his hand raised in a final, ambiguous salute. The Swedish coast blurred into the mist, and the vast, grey expanse of the Skagerrak opened up before the nose of the plane. Voss checked his instruments. The compass, as Arvidsson had promised, was glitched, spinning lazily and biased 10 degrees to the east. He was a courier of a ghost story, flying a limping bird back to a Reich that was starving for a victory. He knew that when he landed at Stavanger, he wouldn't be met with handcuffs, but with a staff car and a debriefing team. The Swedes hadn't just given him his freedom, they had given him a script. And as the Norwegian coastline appeared on the horizon, Voss realized the hardest part of the mission wasn't the crash or the interrogation, it was the acting. The concrete apron at Stavanger Sola Airfield was slick with a fine drizzle when Voss's battered Ju-88 touched down, its starboard engine trailing a thin, rhythmic plume of white smoke. He hadn't even cut the ignition before a staff car, a black Mercedes-Benz 170V, raced toward the revetment. The Abwehr officers didn't care about the pilot's fatigue or the shattered nose glass. They cared about the heavy, lead-lined canister the technicians were already winching out of the aircraft's belly. "The intervalometer failed, and my compass was sluggish," Voss told the debriefing officer, his voice practiced and flat, mirroring the exhaustion of a man who had just escaped neutral internment. "I drifted east of my mark. I think I caught something over Karlskrona. Large-scale construction. Allied silhouettes." The film was rushed to the underground darkrooms of the Luftwaffe Command North. For 6 hours, Voss sat in a windowless room, nursing a cup of synthetic coffee, while the best photo analysts in the Reich pored over the negatives with magnifying loupes and stereoscopes. He waited for the door to burst open, for the shout of "forgery," and the cold steel of handcuffs. He imagined the analysts finding the microscopic seams, where the Swedish technicians had stitched British destroyers into the Baltic mist. Instead, the door opened to reveal Colonel Steinhoff, the regional head of Luftflotte 5. He wasn't angry, he was pale. He dropped a set of wet, oversized prints onto the table. "You were lucky your compass failed, Lieutenant. If you hadn't drifted, we would have missed the build-up entirely. Look at this." Voss looked. The Swedish forgeries were breathtaking. Under the harsh light of the briefing room, the composite masks were invisible. The grain of the film was uniform, the shadows of the phantom cranes in Karlskrona perfectly aligned with the low Baltic sun. To the German High Command, it was the smoking gun. They didn't see a Swedish trick, they saw a knife aimed at the throat of the fatherland from the north. The reaction was swift and catastrophic for the German defensive line. Within 48 hours, the teletype machines in Berlin were screaming. The OKW, High Command of the Armed Forces, concluded that the Allies were preparing a Nordic pincer, an invasion through neutral Sweden to seize the iron ore mines and cut off the German army in Norway. The bait was swallowed whole. 3 veteran infantry divisions and a brigade of Sturmgeschütz 3 assault guns, desperately needed to reinforce the crumbling front in Poland, were instead diverted to the Baltic coast. Fuel reserves, already dangerously low, were redirected to air bases in Denmark and northern Germany to intercept a fleet that didn't exist. Voss watched from the sidelines as the machinery of the Reich pivoted based on the evidence he had carried in his belly. He was awarded the Iron Cross First Class for his heroic reconnaissance, but as the medal was pinned to his tunic, all he could see was the faint, polite smile of Major Arvidsson in that sun-drenched office in Stockholm. He was a hero built on a foundation of Swedish shadows. The fog of the Baltic War didn't truly lift for Erich Voss until a rainy afternoon in 1952. Sitting in a small cafe in Hamburg, he opened a package from a contact in Stockholm, a declassified file from the Swedish Seabyren, the wartime military intelligence agency. Inside was a copy of the very contact sheets he had flown back to Stavanger, but with the original, undoctored negatives attached. For 8 years, Voss had lived with the guilt of a hero who had been a puppet. Now, the documents revealed the cold, mathematical heart of Swedish neutrality. Sweden's decision to release Voss with a poisoned camera wasn't an act of pro-Allied sentiment, it was a desperate move for national survival. By 1944, the Swedish government knew the tide had turned. If the German army in Norway felt a direct threat from the west, they might have preemptively invaded Sweden to secure the Iron Road and the Baltic ports. By planting the lie of an Allied buildup in Karlskrona, the Swedes created a Fortress Sweden in the mind of the German High Command. They forced the Wehrmacht to stay on the defensive, staring at a horizon where no ships would ever appear, while the real war ground to its inevitable conclusion hundreds of miles to the south. The files revealed that Major Arvidsson had been part of a secret cell that maintained a back-channel to London. The British had provided the technical templates for the Phantom ships, high-resolution shots of their own destroyers taken in Scapa Flow, which the Swedish darkroom experts then meticulously layered into the Malmö and Karlskrona footage. It was a masterpiece of passive-active intelligence. Sweden had protected its borders not with mines or tanks, but with a roll of Agfa film and a captured pilot they could trust to be a convincing liar. Voss looked at a final photograph in the file. It was a grainy shot of himself, taken through a two-way mirror during his interrogation in Stockholm. He looked exhausted, haunted, and utterly sincere. The Swedish analysts had noted, Subject Voss displays the necessary psychological stress to bypass Abwehr scrutiny. His survival instinct is our primary delivery mechanism. He realized then that his unexpected freedom had been the final piece of the engineering. Had they kept him, the Germans would have suspected a leak. By letting him escape with a limping plane and a glitched compass, the Swedes had crafted a narrative of a lucky pilot who had stumbled upon the greatest secret of the war. As the sun set over the ruins of Hamburg, Voss folded the papers. He had been the spy they let go, a man who had won a medal for a lie that helped save a country he wasn't even fighting for. The Swedish neutrality hadn't been a state of being, it had been a weapon, one made of glass, silver nitrate, and the perfect manipulation of a man who just wanted to fly home.